I'm Sarah Mitchell, 42, and it's been 23 years since my husband, Captain David Mitchell, died saving lives in the World Trade Center on September 11th, last month. At the annual memorial dinner honoring our fallen heroes, Fire Chief Reynolds stood at the podium and delivered what should have been a tribute to David's sacrifice. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "Some widows honored their husband's memory by moving forward. Others become a burden to the department and the community." The room fell silent as 200 people turned to stare at me. What Chief Reynolds didn't know was that I'd discovered something about David's death that would expose the corruption within the fire department and make him regret every word. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let me take you back to understand why Chief Reynolds' words cut so deep. David and I met in 1987 at Mount Sinai Hospital, where I worked as a trauma nurse in the emergency department. He'd brought in a fellow firefighter who'd suffered smoke inhalation during a warehouse fire in Queens. While his colleague was being treated, David paced the waiting room like a caged lion, his soot-stained uniform telling the story of his night. "Your friend is going to be fine," I told him, and something in his eyes when he looked at me made my heart skip. 3 months later, he proposed with a ring he'd saved 6 months to buy on a firefighter's salary. Our wedding album, which I still keep on my nightstand, captures those golden early years. David in his dress blues, me in my grandmother's altered wedding dress, surrounded by his firehouse family. Page after page of laughter, of hope, of a love so pure it still takes my breath away. We tried for children for 8 years, month after month of disappointment, of medical appointments, of treatments that drained our savings and our hope. But instead of driving us apart, infertility brought us closer. David would hold me after each negative test, whispering, "We have each other, Sarah. That's enough for me." He threw himself into his work with even more passion, treating every call like it was his chance to save someone else's family. By 2001, he'd been promoted to captain of Engine Company 23 in Manhattan. His men adored him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do first. I supported him by supporting his brothers. I organized the Wives Auxiliary, cooked meals for families when firefighters were injured, and used my medical training to help with everything from treating minor burns to counseling families through trauma. The firehouse was our second home, and those men were our extended family. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, David kissed me goodbye at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was running late for my shift and glanced at the kitchen clock. His lips were warm against mine, and he smelled like the coffee he'd just finished. "Love you, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, using the nickname that always made me smile. "Love you too, Captain Mitchell," I replied, not knowing those would be the last words we'd ever exchange. I was drawing blood from a patient when the first plane hit. Someone in the hallway shouted about a terrible accident, a small plane crashing into the World Trade Center. Like everyone else, I assumed it was a tragic mistake. Then the second plane hit, and we knew. The hospital exploded into controlled chaos. Every available doctor, nurse, and technician was called in. We prepared for hundreds of casualties that, heartbreakingly, never came. Instead, we watched the towers fall on the television in the break room, and I felt my world collapse with them. David's company was among the first responders. I knew this without having to call anyone because I knew my husband. He would have run toward the danger while others ran away. That's who he was. The family staging area at the pier became my second home for the next 72 hours. Hundreds of us waited, clutching photos of our missing loved ones, desperate for any news. I held David's graduation picture from the fire academy, the one where his smile was so bright it could light up a room. On September 14th, a chaplain approached me with 2 department officials. I knew before they spoke. You learn to read faces when you work in trauma medicine, and theirs told the story I didn't want to hear. "Mrs. Mitchell," the chaplain said gently, "we need to talk." David's final radio transmission, which I wouldn't see until months later, was time-stamped at 9:58 a.m., Engine 23 to Manhattan. "We're heading up the south stairwell, Tower 2, floor 15. We've got civilians trapped above us. Send more units to the north side." He saved 23 people that day, 23 mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters who went home to their families because my husband chose to climb higher instead of evacuating. His body was found on the 18th floor, positioned as if he'd been shielding someone. The medical examiner said he died instantly when the tower collapsed. The department was incredible in those first weeks. Chief Reynolds himself came to the house, sat in our living room, and promised that David's sacrifice would never be forgotten. He assured me that the department would take care of me, that I was family, that David's heroism would be honored forever. "Your husband was the best of us," he said, his eyes seemingly sincere. "We'll make sure his legacy lives on." The funeral was attended by thousands. Firefighters from across the country came to honor David. The flag draped over his casket was handed to me by Chief Reynolds, who squeezed my hand and whispered, "We've got you, Sarah. Always." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. David's personal effects arrived in a cardboard box 3 weeks after the funeral, his helmet, dented and ash-covered, his badge, tarnished but intact, his turnout coat, still smelling of smoke and sacrifice. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a handwritten note I'd never seen before. "Sarah," it read in David's careful script, "if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I wrote this after the warehouse fire last month when Tommy almost didn't make it out. I need you to know that loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. You made me a better man, a better captain, a better human being. Don't let grief make you small. The world needs your light. Forever yours, David." I clutched that note and sobbed until I had nothing left. The grief was unlike anything I'd experienced. Even after years of working in trauma medicine, it was a physical presence, sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Some days I couldn't get out of bed. Other days I worked double shifts at the hospital because staying busy was the only way to quiet the screaming in my head. The department's support in those early months was genuine and comprehensive. They helped with insurance claims, connected me with grief counselors, and included me in every memorial event. The other firefighter widows became my lifeline. We understood each other's pain in ways no one else could. I threw myself into advocacy work, partly for healing, and partly because I felt called to honor David's memory through service. I testified before Congress about first responder benefits. I worked with the Red Cross to help other 9/11's families navigate the complex web of assistance programs. I spoke at schools about the heroes who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. The community embraced me. I was the grieving widow who turned her pain into purpose, and people admired that transformation. Local newspapers wrote articles about my advocacy work. The mayor invited me to city events. I was frequently asked to speak at memorial services for other fallen first responders. But as the years passed, something began to shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Phone calls weren't returned as quickly. Invitations to department events became less frequent. When I'd suggest changes to memorial procedures or question certain policies, I was politely dismissed with comments like, "We appreciate your input, Sarah, but we have protocols to follow." By the 5th anniversary of 9/11's, I felt like I was being slowly erased from the community that had once embraced me. It was as if my advocacy work, instead of being seen as honoring David's memory, was now viewed as inconvenient. I was becoming the widow who asked too many questions, who wouldn't simply accept things as they were. Chief Reynolds was always polite in public, but his demeanor toward me had grown cold. Where once he'd greeted me with warmth and genuine affection, now our interactions felt perfunctory, almost reluctant. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2006, exactly 5 years and 1 month after David's death. Plain, white envelope, no return address. My name and address written in block letters with a black ballpoint pen. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that would change everything. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're not the only widow being Look into the benefit distributions. Ask why some families got more than others. Ask why your husband's death report was filed as routine structural collapse when others were classified as hazardous duty death. Someone needs to speak for those who can't speak for themselves." A friend who knew your husband. My hands shook as I read it twice, then 3 times. Hazardous duty death. David's classification was routine structural collapse. I'd never even seen his official death report. The department had handled all the paperwork, assuring me that everything was being processed correctly. That afternoon, I called the benefits office and requested a copy of David's file. The clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, whom I'd known for years, seemed nervous. "Sarah, honey, you don't need to worry about those details. Everything was filed properly. I'd still like to see the paperwork, Maria. It's important to me. There was a long pause. I'll have to get approval from Chief Reynolds. Approval for my own husband's death certificate and benefit documentation. It's just protocol, dear. I'll call you back. She never did. I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. At memorial events, I began listening to other widows talk about their experiences. Slowly, a pattern emerged that I'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. Janet Morrison, whose husband died in the same tower as David, mentioned receiving a settlement that was nearly double what I'd gotten. The hazardous duty classification made all the difference, she said casually over coffee. Tommy was on the 20th floor when the building came down. David was on the 18th floor, 2 floors lower, but in the same circumstances. Carol Stevens, whose husband died in Tower 1, received additional compensation for extraordinary heroic action because he'd been found near civilian survivors. David had been found in the same position, literally shielding someone with his body. I began making calls, carefully and quietly. The more I learned, the more discrepancies I found. Firefighters who died in virtually identical circumstances had their deaths classified differently, resulting in dramatically different benefit packages for their families. When I tried to discuss this with Chief Reynolds at the annual memorial dinner that year, his response was swift and dismissive. "Sarah, I understand grief can make people see patterns that aren't there. You're looking for reasons to be upset when you should be focusing on healing. I'm not looking for anything except understanding why my husband's death was classified differently than others who died in identical circumstances." His face hardened. "Your husband's case was handled properly. I'd suggest you trust the professionals who know these procedures better than you do." That night, lying in bed, I realized that the anonymous letter writer was right. Someone needed to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And whether the department liked it or not, that someone was going to be me. I've always been methodical. It's what made me a good trauma nurse, and what would make me a relentless investigator. That winter, I transformed my dining room into a makeshift research center, covering the table with spreadsheets, photocopied documents, and color-coded files. I started with what I could access publicly: death certificates, memorial records, newspaper obituaries. I cross-referenced every firefighter who died on 9/11s with their official cause of death classification and corresponding benefit levels. The pattern that emerged was staggering. Firefighters with political connections, those whose families knew city councilmen, whose fathers had been chiefs, whose brothers worked in City Hall, were overwhelmingly classified as hazardous duty deaths or extraordinary heroic action. Their families received the maximum benefits available. Firefighters like David, who came from working-class backgrounds with no political influence, were systematically classified as routine structural collapse or standard line-of-duty death. The difference in compensation was sometimes as much as $200,000. I created a spreadsheet that would become the backbone of everything that followed. 47 firefighters who died in nearly identical circumstances, yet their classifications varied wildly based on factors that had nothing to do with their actual heroism or the circumstances of their deaths. David's file, which I finally obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request after the department refused to provide it directly, revealed the smoking gun I'd been looking for. The original death report, filed by the first investigator on scene, classified David's death as hazardous duty civilian rescue operation, but this had been crossed out and changed to routine structural collapse 3 weeks later. The change was initialed RR. Robert Reynolds. My hands trembled as I held the document. Chief Reynolds had personally downgraded David's death classification, costing me and David's memory tens of thousands of dollars in benefits and recognition. But why? What possible motivation could he have? The answer came when I started digging into the fund distributions themselves. The 9/11's compensation funds were substantial billions of dollars flowing through various channels. Someone managing those distributions could easily skim money or redirect funds, especially if they controlled the classification process that determined benefit levels. I spent weeks at the public library, learning about municipal finance, benefit administration, and fraud investigation techniques. I taught myself to read complex financial documents and understand bureaucratic procedures. Every evening, I'd return home and update my spreadsheet, adding new connections and documenting new discrepancies. The scope of what I was uncovering was overwhelming. This wasn't just about a few misclassified deaths. This was a systematic scheme to defraud 9/11's families, with Chief Reynolds at the center of it all. But I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed proof of intent, documentation of the conspiracy, evidence that would hold up in court. And I needed allies, because going up against the fire department alone would be suicide. That's when I remembered. Detective Maria Santos. Maria Santos had lost her husband Luis, a detective with the NYPD, when he responded to the towers on 9/11's. We'd met at a grief support group in 2002, and had stayed in touch over the years. Maria was tough, smart, and had investigative skills I desperately needed. I called her on a Thursday evening in February 2007, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd discovered. "Maria, I need to show you something. Can you come over?" She arrived within an hour, took one look at my dining room research center, and whistled low. "Jesus, Sarah, what have you gotten yourself into?" I walked her through the spreadsheet, the discrepancies, David's altered death report. Her cop instincts kicked in immediately. "This is fraud," she said flatly. "Large-scale, systematic fraud. And if Reynolds is behind it, ... She trailed off, studying the documents more carefully. "What is it?" Luce's death was classified as routine structural collapse too, but he died trying to evacuate civilians from the 20th floor of Tower 1. "How is that routine?" We spent the next 4 hours going through her husband's files. Sure enough, Luce's death had been similarly downgraded by Chief Reynolds, costing Maria's family approximately $150,000 in benefits. "That bastard," she whispered, staring at the altered paperwork. "That absolute bastard." Maria brought investigative discipline to my emotional quest for answers. She taught me how to document everything properly, how to protect evidence, how to build a case that would stand up to scrutiny. More importantly, she had connections within law enforcement who could help us access records that I never could have obtained alone. Our breakthrough came 3 weeks later when Maria's contact in the Internal Affairs Division provided us with something explosive, a recording from Chief Reynolds' office, captured accidentally during a routine maintenance check of the phone system. We listened to it together in Maria's car, parked in a grocery store lot to avoid any chance of surveillance. Reynolds' voice was unmistakable. "The key is managing the problematic widows before they cause real trouble. Mitchell and Santos are asking too many questions. We need to isolate them, discredit them if necessary. The department can't afford to have this compensation issue become public." Another voice, which Maria identified as Deputy Chief Harrison. "What do you suggest?" "Standard procedure. Question their mental state. Grief makes people irrational. If they push too hard, we hint that their husbands weren't the heroes they think they were. Most widows will back down rather than risk tarnishing their husband's memory. And if they don't back down, then we make their lives difficult. Very difficult." The recording was only 4 minutes long, but it confirmed everything we suspected. Reynolds wasn't just stealing money from 9/11's families, he was actively working to silence anyone who might expose him. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I found my car windows smashed and my tires slashed. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper. "Accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business." When I called Maria, her voice was grim. "Same thing happened to me last night. We're getting close, Sarah, and they know it." The intimidation only strengthened my resolve. David had run toward danger to save innocent people. The least I could do was follow his example, even if the danger now was bureaucratic rather than physical. But I was also realistic. Reynolds had power, connections, and resources we couldn't match. If we were going to expose him, we needed to be smarter, more careful, and absolutely certain of our evidence. The war had begun, and I intended to win it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Williams, the medical examiner who had handled many of the 9/11's autopsy reports, reached out to me through Maria's contact in the police department. She'd heard about our investigation and had something important to share. We met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan and the fire department's sphere of influence. Dr. Williams was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that had seen too much tragedy. "I've been carrying this burden for 6 years," she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid of the consequences." Inside the folder was David's original autopsy report, not the one received, but the actual medical findings that Dr. Williams had submitted to the fire department in October 2001. My hands shook as I read her conclusion. Subject died as a result of traumatic injuries sustained while attempting civilian rescue. Operation. Physical evidence indicates deceased positioned his body to shield civilian victim from falling debris. Cause of death. Heroic action in line of duty. This isn't what I received, I whispered. No, it wouldn't be. Chief Reynolds requested a revised report 3 weeks after I submitted this one. He said there were administrative inconsistencies that needed to be corrected for insurance purposes. I looked up at her, my heart pounding. What kind of inconsistencies? He claimed that the civilian David was found with had actually died before the building collapse, which would make David's positioning coincidental rather than heroic. He provided witness statements that contradicted the physical evidence I'd documented. Dr. Williams pulled out another document, the falsified report that had been used to justify David's reduced benefits. The medical findings were identical, but the interpretation and conclusion had been completely rewritten. I should have refused to sign it, she said, tears in her eyes. But Reynolds threatened to have me fired, to destroy my career. He said the city needed to control costs, that too many families were getting maximum benefits for ordinary deaths. He made it sound like I was doing something noble by helping the city save money. How many reports did you alter? For all at Reynolds' direct request. All with the same justification about administrative inconsistencies and cost control. The number matched exactly with my spreadsheet. 47 firefighters whose deaths had been systematically devalued, their families cheated out of recognition and compensation they deserved. Dr. Williams, this is fraud. Massive, systematic fraud. These families have a right to know what was stolen from them. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know, that's why I'm here. I'm willing to testify, to provide the original reports, to do whatever it takes to make this right. Those men were heroes, and their families deserved the truth. Maria, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. We need to be very careful about how we proceed. Reynolds obviously has the power to destroy careers and lives. If we're going to take him down, we need to be absolutely bulletproof. That evening, I sat in David's chair in our living room, holding his helmet and staring at the original autopsy report. The medical examiner had confirmed what I'd always known in my heart. David died protecting someone else. Even in his final moments, he was a hero, and Chief Reynolds had stolen that recognition from him and from me. But more than that, Reynolds had stolen from 46 other families. He'd built his career on the backs of dead heroes, profiting from their sacrifice while their widows struggled to make ends meet. The anger that had been simmering inside me for months finally boiled over. I wasn't just fighting for David anymore. I was fighting for every family that had been cheated, every hero whose memory had been diminished, every widow who had been told she was imagining things when she questioned discrepancies. Chief Reynolds had picked the wrong widow to mess with, and he was about to learn exactly how much trouble one determined woman could cause. Maria's contact in internal affairs provided us with the next piece of the puzzle. A week after our meeting with Dr. Williams, it was an email chain between Chief Reynolds and several city officials, including the deputy mayor and the director of financial services. The subject line read, 9/11's Compensation Fund, Damage, Control Strategies. The first email, dated January 2007, was from Reynolds to the deputy mayor. We have a potential problem with some of the 9/11's widows, asking questions about benefit classifications. Mrs. Mitchell and Mrs. Santos are becoming particularly persistent. If they continue investigating, they might uncover the administrative adjustments we made to control fund disbursements. The deputy mayor's response was chilling in its casualness. Handle it quietly. The city saved over $8 million through your That money funded essential services and infrastructure improvements. We can't afford a scandal that would require us to pay retroactive benefits. $8 million. That's how much had been stolen from 9/11's families through Reynolds' systematic fraud. $8 million that should have gone to widows and children, instead diverted to city projects, and, I suspected, personal accounts. Another email from Reynolds revealed the scope of the cover-up. I've spoken with the benefits office, the medical examiner's office, and the records department. Everyone understands the importance of maintaining consistency in our documentation. Any requests for file reviews will be directed through my office for approval. The final email in the chain was the most damning. Reynolds to the Director of Financial Services, the Mitchell situation requires special attention. She's too smart and too persistent. I'm implementing Protocol 7 to isolate her from department resources and community support. If that fails, we may need to consider more aggressive measures. Protocol 7. Maria and I researched that term for days before finding a reference in an old NYPD manual. It was a systematic approach to discrediting whistleblowers through character, assassination, professional isolation, and psychological intimidation. Everything that had happened to me over the past 2 years suddenly made sense. The gradual cooling of relationships within the firefighting community, the declined invitations to events, the dismissive responses to my advocacy work. Reynolds hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been orchestrating a campaign to destroy my credibility and isolate me from potential allies. But the emails also revealed something else. I wasn't Reynolds' only problem. According to the correspondence, at least 12 other families had started asking questions about their benefit levels. Some had hired lawyers, others had contacted journalists. The situation was spiraling out of Reynolds' control, which meant he was becoming desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities. Maria and I decided to force Reynolds' hand. We drafted a formal complaint to the city's Inspector General, documenting the fraud with copies of the altered medical reports, the discriminatory benefit classifications, and the email evidence of the cover-up conspiracy. But we didn't file it immediately. Instead, we made sure word of our complaint reached Reynolds through carefully placed rumors and strategic conversations. We wanted him to know that we had the evidence to destroy him, and we wanted to see how he would respond. The response came faster than we expected. 3 days after we leaked news of our complaint, I received a call from the fire department's legal counsel. They were conducting an investigation into my allegations of misconduct and needed to interview me immediately. When I arrived at the department headquarters, I was escorted to a conference room where Reynolds sat with 2 lawyers and a stenographer. His face was calm, but his eyes were cold with fury. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said without preamble, "you're making some very serious accusations against this department and against me personally. Accusations that are not only false but potentially libelous. Everything I've documented is true and supported by evidence. Evidence that was obtained illegally through unauthorized access to confidential files. Evidence that may have been tampered with or fabricated." I felt a chill run down my spine. Reynolds was going to claim that our evidence was inadmissible, that we'd broken laws in obtaining it. He was setting up a defense strategy that would discredit everything we'd discovered. Chief Reynolds, 47 families were systematically cheated out of benefits they deserved. That's not a legal technicality, that's fraud. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that the stenographer couldn't catch. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sarah. Walk away now, while you still can." I looked him directly in the eyes. "My husband died saving people. You dishonored his memory and stole from his family. I will never walk away." The meeting ended with Reynolds' lawyers threatening to file criminal charges against me for harassment and unlawful access to confidential records. As I left the building, I realized that the real war was just beginning. The investigation was consuming my life, and it was starting to show. I'd lost 15 pounds, was surviving on 3 hours of sleep a night, and had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking my rearview mirror. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every phone call might be another threat. The threatening note I found on my windshield after the confrontation with Reynolds was more specific than the previous ones. "Final warning, stop digging, or face the consequences. We know where you work. We know where you live. Accidents happen." The psychological warfare was working. I'd installed security cameras at my house, changed my phone number twice, and started varying my route to work. The trauma nurse who had spent years helping other people through their worst moments was now living in constant fear. My relationship with my sister Karen deteriorated rapidly. She'd been supportive initially, but as the investigation intensified and the threats escalated, she became increasingly worried about my safety and sanity. "Sarah, you're scaring me," she said during one of our weekly dinners. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks. You jump every time someone walks behind you. This obsession with Reynolds is destroying you." "It's not an obsession. It's justice." "For who?" "David's gone, honey. He's been gone for 6 years. You're not bringing him back by destroying yourself over some paperwork discrepancies." "Paperwork discrepancies." I couldn't hide my anger. "Karen, they stole $8 million from 9/11's families. They dishonored David's memory and the memory of 46 other heroes. How is that a paperwork discrepancy? She sighed, reaching across the table to take my hand. I'm worried about you. Really worried. When's the last time you went on a date? When's the last time you did something just for fun? You've turned into this angry, paranoid person. And that's not who David would want you to be. Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth. I had become obsessed. I was living and breathing this investigation to the exclusion of everything else. But I couldn't stop, not when I was so close to exposing the truth. My work at the hospital was suffering too. I'd been a charge nurse in the emergency department for 12 years. But my supervisor pulled me aside after I snapped at a resident over a minor procedure mistake. Sarah, you need to take some time off. You're making errors in judgment. You're short-tempered with staff, and patients are starting to notice. That's not like you. I'm fine, Janet, just tired. You're not fine. You're distracted and potentially compromising patient care. Take a leave of absence. Get some help. Come back. When you're ready to be the nurse I know you are. The forced leave of absence was both a blessing and a curse. It gave me more time to focus on the investigation, but it also left me isolated and financially stressed. Without my salary, I was burning through my savings to pay for legal consultations, document copying, and private investigator services. The isolation was the worst part. Most of my friendships had been built around the hospital and the firefighting community. Now I was cut off from both. Former colleagues avoided me, either because they thought I was having a breakdown or because they'd been warned away by hospital administration. The only person who truly understood what I was going through was Maria, who was facing similar pressures. Her police contacts were being reassigned or transferred. Her own supervisors were questioning her judgment and suggesting she seek psychological counseling. They're trying to isolate us, she said during one of our clandestine meetings in a diner outside the city. Make us look crazy so no one will listen to us. Is it working? I asked, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes that I knew was reflected in my own. Some days, yeah, some days I wonder if we're tilting at windmills, if this is all just grief-making, USC conspiracies where there's only bureaucratic incompetence. But then I'd go home and look at David's note, the one he'd written after almost losing Tommy in that warehouse fire. Don't let grief make you small. The world needs your light. David had always seen the best in people, had always believed that good would triumph over evil if someone was brave enough to fight for it. He'd died believing that his sacrifice would make a difference, that his life had meaning. I couldn't dishonor that belief by giving up, no matter how much it was costing me personally. Some fights are worth having, even if they destroy you in the process. This was one of those fights. Finding a lawyer willing to take on the fire department and City Hall proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. The first 3 attorneys I consulted politely declined, citing conflicts of interest or insufficient evidence. The 4th told me bluntly that I was delusional and suggested I seek psychiatric help. It was Maria who found Michael Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in government corruption cases. His office was in a modest building in Queens, far from the prestigious law firms of Manhattan, but his track record was impressive. He'd successfully prosecuted police corruption cases, exposed municipal fraud, and wasn't afraid to take on powerful institutions. Michael was in his early 40s, second-generation, Chinese-American, with an intensity that reminded me of David when he was focused on a particularly difficult rescue operation. He listened to our presentation for 3 hours, without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly just absorbing the enormity of what we were alleging. This is massive, he said finally, reviewing our documentation. Systematic fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations. If we can prove even half of what you've documented, it's the biggest municipal corruption case in the city's history. Can we prove it? I asked. Legally, maybe. The evidence is compelling, but circumstantial in places. We need more direct proof of Reynolds' criminal intent and the conspiracy with city officials. But more importantly, are you prepared for what this will cost you personally? I thought about David's note, about the 46 other families who'd been cheated, about the $8 million that had been stolen. I'm prepared. Michael spent the next 6 weeks building our case methodically. He subpoenaed records, interviewed witnesses, and hired a forensic accountant to trace the money trail. What we discovered was even worse than we'd imagined. The $8 million saved through fraudulent death classifications had been funneled into a discretionary fund controlled by Reynolds and several city officials. Some of it funded legitimate city projects, but at least $2 million had been diverted. 2 personal accounts through consulting contracts with shell companies. Reynolds had been living well beyond his fire chief salary. A vacation home in the Hamptons, private school tuition for his kids, a boat, expensive cars, all purchased after 2002. All funded by money that should have gone to 9/11's families. The legal brief Michael prepared was 847 pages long, documenting 47 cases of fraudulent death classification, the systematic conspiracy to cover up the scheme, and the pattern of intimidation used against families who asked questions. Each case was meticulously documented with medical evidence, financial records, and witness testimony. "We're not just suing for financial damages," Michael explained. "We're seeking criminal prosecution for fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations." Reynolds and his co-conspirators could face decades in prison. But the legal case was only half the battle. We needed public support, media attention, and political pressure to ensure that the full scope of the corruption was exposed. Reynolds had powerful allies who would try to minimize the scandal and protect their own interests. "We go public in 2 weeks," Michael said. "I've arranged interviews with investigative journalists, prepared press releases, and scheduled meetings with federal prosecutors. Once this story breaks, there's no going back." The night before we filed the lawsuit, I couldn't sleep. I sat in David's chair, holding his helmet, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years of investigation, threats, isolation, and personal sacrifice, all leading to this final confrontation with the man who had dishonored my husband's memory. Tomorrow, Chief Reynolds would learn that his victims weren't as powerless as he'd believed. Tomorrow, the world would know what he'd done to the families of fallen heroes. Tomorrow, justice would finally have its day. Rachel Torres from the investigative unit at Channel 7 News had been following corruption stories for 15 years. Michael had contacted her because of her reputation for thorough, fearless journalism that couldn't be intimidated or bought off. We met at her office on a Friday morning in March 2008. Rachel was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of a predator sizing up its prey. "This is incredible," she said, reviewing our evidence. "How long have you been working on this investigation?" 2 years, I replied. "But the fraud has been going on since 2001, and the fire department knows you have this evidence." "Chief Reynolds knows, so do several city officials. They've been trying to discredit us and intimidate us into silence." Rachel's eyes lit up. "They threatened you." Maria produced the threatening notes, the recordings of the vandalism to our cars, documentation of the systematic isolation we'd faced. Rachel's cameramen started rolling as she interviewed us about the intimidation campaign. The press release we'd prepared was explosive. "Widow exposes massive 9/11s, fraud, fire chief stole millions from hero families." But Rachel convinced us to hold back some details to maintain the element of surprise. "We want Reynolds to respond publicly before he knows the full scope of what you have," she explained. "Let him lie on camera. Let him dismiss your allegations as the ravings of a grief-stricken widow. Then we'll release the evidence that proves he's lying." The strategy was brilliant but risky. If Reynolds managed to suppress the story or discredit us before the full evidence came out, we'd lose our only chance at justice. Rachel scheduled the first interview for the following Tuesday. The timing was carefully chosen to maximize impact. Tuesday evening news, when viewership was highest, followed by a more detailed segment on the weekend investigative program. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked me the night before the interview. "Once this story breaks, Reynolds and his allies will throw everything they have at you. They'll attack your character, your mental state, your marriage. They'll try to make this about a crazy widow rather than systematic fraud." I thought about all the families who'd been cheated, all the heroes whose memories had been dishonored. I've been ready since the day I found David's altered death report. The interview took place in Rachel's studio, not the news desk, to create a more intimate atmosphere. She started with softballs: my background, my marriage to David, his death on 9/11s. Then she gradually moved into the investigation. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're alleging that Fire Chief Reynolds deliberately defrauded 9/11's families. That's an extremely serious accusation. It's an extremely serious crime," I replied, "and I have the evidence to prove it." I walked through the key points methodically: the altered death reports, the discriminatory benefit classifications, the $8 million that was diverted from its intended purpose. Rachel had coached me to stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. What do you say to people who might view this as the actions of a grieving widow who can't accept her husband's death? I'd say they should look at the evidence. 47 families were systematically cheated. This isn't about grief, it's about justice. The interview concluded with Rachel's promise that Channel 7 would continue investigating the story and would seek comment from Chief Reynolds and city officials. That evening, I watched myself on the news, feeling surreal as my allegations were broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The story was picked up immediately by other local stations and then by national news outlets. By midnight, my phone was ringing constantly, reporters wanting follow-up interviews, other 9/11's families asking if they'd been cheated, supporters offering help and encouragement. The war had officially begun, and Chief Reynolds was about to discover that sometimes the person you dismiss as powerless is actually the most dangerous enemy you could have. The television interview aired on Tuesday, March 18, 2008, at 6 p.m. By 6:30, my phone was ringing, non-stop. By 7 o'clock, news vans were parked outside my house. By 8 o'clock, the story had gone national. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The Channel 7 website crashed from traffic as people tried to access the full interview and supporting documents. Social media exploded with outrage over the fraud allegations. #JusticeForDavid started trending within hours. But it was the phone calls from other families that moved me most. Janet Morrison, whose husband Tommy died in Tower 2, called me, crying, "Sarah, I always wondered why our benefits seemed low compared to other families. I thought I was imagining things. Thank you for having the courage to speak up." Carol Stevens, whose husband died in Tower 1, was angrier. "That bastard looked me in the eye at Tommy's funeral and told me the department would take care of me. Then he stole money that should have gone to my children's college fund." Within 24 hours, 17 more families had contacted Michael's office, all reporting similar discrepancies in their benefit classifications. The pattern of fraud was even more extensive than we'd originally documented. Chief Reynolds' response was swift and predictable. He held a press conference Wednesday morning, flanked by department lawyers and city officials. His strategy was exactly what Rachel had predicted: act the messenger rather than address the message. "Mrs. Mitchell is a troubled woman who has been unable to cope with her husband's tragic death," he said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "She's been harassing department personnel for years with increasingly bizarre accusations. We've tried to be patient and understanding, but she's now crossed the line into dangerous territory." He went on to claim that I'd obtained confidential documents illegally, that I'd been stalking department officials, and that my mental state had deteriorated significantly since David's death. It was a masterful performance of character assassination, designed to make me look like an unhinged widow rather than a determined investigator. But Reynolds made a critical mistake. When asked about the specific allegations of altered death reports, he categorically denied that any such alterations had ever occurred. The death classifications for all 9/11's firefighters were made according to strict protocols by qualified medical and administrative personnel. No reports were altered, and no families were shortchanged. Rachel called me immediately after the press conference. "He just lied on camera about something we can prove. We're running the follow-up story tonight with Dr. Williams' testimony and copies of the altered reports." That evening's newscast was devastating for Reynolds. Dr. Williams appeared on camera, showing the original autopsy reports she'd filed, and the altered versions Reynolds had forced her to sign. The evidence was undeniable. Reynolds had just committed perjury on live television. "I've carried this guilt for 7 years," Dr. Williams said, her voice shaking. "Chief Reynolds threatened my career if I didn't cooperate with his scheme. These families deserved better. They deserved the truth." The story exploded across national media. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and the major networks all picked up the investigation. The New York Times ran a front-page story with the headline, "Fire Chief Accused of Defrauding 9/11's Families." The Washington Post called it the most shocking betrayal of public trust since Watergate. Federal investigators announced they were opening a criminal investigation. The FBI raided Reynolds' office and seized financial records. The mayor called for an independent review of all 9/11's benefit distributions, but the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Fire Commissioner James Walsh, Reynolds' boss and longtime ally. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to personally apologize for what you've been through. If these allegations are proven true, Chief Reynolds will face the full consequences of his actions. Commissioner, they're not allegations, they're facts, and it's not me you should be apologizing to. It's the 47 families he cheated and the memory of the heroes he dishonored. The momentum was building beyond what I'd ever imagined possible. What had started as one widow's quest for answers had become a national scandal that would ultimately bring down one of the most powerful men in the city's fire department. Reynolds thought he could silence me by calling me a burden. Instead, he'd given me the perfect platform to expose his crimes to the world. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Within 2 weeks of the story breaking, FBI agents had executed search warrants on Reynolds' home, his bank accounts, and the homes of 3 city officials implicated in the conspiracy. The forensic accountant's preliminary report confirmed that over $2.30 million had been diverted to personal accounts through fraudulent consulting contracts. Michael called me with an update that made my hands shake. "Sarah, they're offering Reynolds a plea deal. 20 years in federal prison in exchange for full cooperation and restitution to all affected families. Is he going to take it?" His lawyers are still negotiating. But here's the important part: they want you to testify at the plea hearing. They want Reynolds to face the families he cheated before he's sentenced. The thought of confronting Reynolds in court was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was the moment I'd been working toward for 2 years, the chance to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what his crimes had cost. But first, there was the memorial dinner to get through. The annual event was scheduled for Saturday, April 12th. Just 3 weeks after the story broke. The fire department had considered canceling it due to the scandal, but the families insisted it proceed. Too many people needed this night to honor their fallen loved ones. I almost didn't go. The thought of facing hundreds of people who now knew every detail of my investigation, my struggles, and my very public battle with Reynolds was overwhelming. But Maria convinced me that staying away would send the wrong message. "You belong there more than anyone," she said. "You're not hiding from these people. You fought for them. You fought for their husbands and fathers and sons." The weeks leading up to the dinner were a whirlwind of media interviews, legal depositions, and meetings with other affected families. I'd become the unofficial spokesperson for the fraud victims, fielding calls from reporters and coordinating with families who were joining the lawsuit. Reynolds, meanwhile, was fighting for his political life. His supporters claimed he was being slighted, that he'd been following orders from city officials who were now distancing themselves from the scandal. His lawyers filed motions challenging the FBI's evidence, claiming the search warrants were invalid and that his civil rights had been violated. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic audit revealed not just the $8 million in diverted funds, but an additional $3 million in questionable expenditures that couldn't be properly accounted for. Reynolds had been running the 9/11's compensation fund like his personal bank account for 7 years. 3 days before the memorial dinner, Michael called with the news I'd been waiting to hear. "Sarah, Reynolds is taking the plea deal. He'll allocate at the hearing next month and face sentencing in July. But here's the best. Parties agreed to make a public apology at the memorial dinner before he resigns." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. This wasn't really about revenge, although there was certainly an element of satisfaction in seeing Reynolds finally held accountable. It was about justice for David and the other heroes whose memories had been tarnished by corruption. The night before the dinner, I sat in David's chair, looking at the program for the event. My name was listed as one of the speakers, invited to address the families and firefighters about the investigation and its aftermath. It was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. I'd written my speech weeks earlier, but kept revising it as events unfolded. The tone had evolved from anger to something more complex: sadness for what had been stolen, gratitude for the justice that was finally coming, and hope for the future. Tomorrow night, I would stand in the same room where Reynolds had called me a burden and tell the assembled crowd exactly what that burden had accomplished. I would honor David's memory not with silence and submission, but with the truth that had set us all free. The memorial dinner was held at the same hotel as always, the grand ballroom decorated with American flags and photos of the fallen heroes, but the atmosphere was completely different from previous years. Instead of the usual subdued grief mixed with celebration of service, there was electricity in the air: anticipation, tension, and for many people, a sense that justice was finally being served. I arrived early, wearing the navy blue dress I'd worn to David's funeral. It felt appropriate somehow, like I was finally laying him to rest properly. Maria was beside me, and Michael had flown in from a conference to be there for support. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as people pointed me out to others who hadn't followed the story closely. Some faces showed admiration, others, curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of disapproval that suggested they thought I'd gone too far in my pursuit of justice. Reynolds arrived exactly at 7 p.m., flanked by 2 department lawyers and looking like a man walking to his execution. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who knew his career, reputation, and freedom were about to end. The dinner proceeded with the usual formalities: the honor guard presentation, the reading of names, the moment of silence. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium with the speech I'd prepared. But as I looked out at the crowd of 200 people, widows, firefighters, city officials, and reporters, I realized I didn't need it. I set the paper aside and spoke from my heart. 7 years ago, Chief Reynolds stood in my living room and promised that David's sacrifice would never be forgotten. He assured me that the department would take care of me, that I was family. Those promises turned out to be lies, but his betrayal revealed something far more important than his character. It revealed mine. I paused, looking directly at Reynolds, who was sitting at the head table, staring at his hands. David died saving 23 people because he believed that protecting others was worth any personal cost. When I discovered that his death had been deliberately devalued and his memory dishonored for financial gain, I had a choice. I could stay quiet and accept the injustice, or I could fight back, even if it meant sacrificing my own comfort and safety. The room was completely silent now, every person hanging on my words. Chief Reynolds called me a burden. He was right. I became a burden to his criminal enterprise. I became a burden to the corrupt system that was stealing from heroes' families. I became a burden to everyone who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. I saw several people in the audience wiping their eyes, including some firefighters who'd previously shunned me. But David taught me that being a burden to bad people is actually a badge of honor. He was a burden to the terrorists who wanted to destroy our city. He was a burden to anyone who believed that evil could triumph if good people did nothing. Reynolds finally looked up, and I saw something I'd never expected to see in his eyes: shame. 47 families were cheated out of recognition and compensation they deserved. $8 million was stolen from people who'd already sacrificed everything. That's not a mistake or an oversight. That's a betrayal of the most sacred trust in our society. The crowd erupted in applause that went on for nearly 2 minutes. When it finally died down, I concluded with the words I'd been saving for this moment. David's note to me said, "Don't let grief make you small. The world needs your light." Chief Reynolds tried to make me small through intimidation and character assassination. Instead, he made me stronger, more determined, and absolutely committed to ensuring that no other family would suffer what we suffered. I looked directly at Reynolds one final time. "Chief Reynolds, you dishonored my husband's memory, stole from his family, and tried to silence me when I sought justice. But you failed. David's memory is stronger than your corruption. Truth is more powerful than your lies, and real justice always wins, in the end." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. When it finally ended, Reynolds stood up slowly, walked to the microphone, and delivered the apology he'd agreed to as part of his plea deal. His words were legally required but clearly painful. "I have betrayed the trust of the families in this room and dishonored the memory of heroes I was sworn to protect. I accept full responsibility for my actions and will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for the harm I've caused." He resigned effective immediately, walked out of the ballroom, and never appeared at another fire department function. 3 months later, he was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. That night, as I drove home past the city David had died protecting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since September 11, 2001. Peace. David's sacrifice had been acknowledged, his memory had been honored, and justice had finally been served. The burden was gone. The morning after the memorial dinner, I woke up to find my phone buzzing with messages from across the country. News outlets were calling my speech one of the most powerful moments in recent memory. Videos of the confrontation had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments supporting my fight for justice. But the most meaningful call came from Fire Commissioner Walsh at 8 a.m. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to personally inform you that Chief Reynolds submitted his resignation letter at midnight last night, effective immediately. Deputy Chief Martinez will serve as interim chief while we conduct a national search for Reynolds' replacement. What about the other officials involved in the conspiracy? The deputy mayor resigned this morning. The director of financial services has been placed on administrative leave pending the federal investigation. We're conducting a complete audit of all compensation programs, not just 9/11's benefits. The resignation letter, which was leaked to the press within hours, was brief but devastating. I can no longer serve as fire chief, knowing that I have betrayed the trust of the families I was sworn to protect. My actions were inexcusable and have brought shame upon this department and the memory of our fallen heroes. I resign immediately and accept full responsibility for my crimes. The media coverage was unprecedented. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, with investigative reports revealing additional corruption throughout city government. Reynolds' case became a symbol of how power could corrupt even those entrusted with protecting heroes' legacies. Within a month, the federal investigation had expanded to include similar benefit programs in other cities. It turned out that the systematic defrauding of first responder families wasn't unique to New York. Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston all launched their own investigations after similar patterns of corruption were discovered. The financial restitution began flowing to affected families almost immediately. The recovered funds, plus interest and penalties, meant that each cheated family received an average of $180,000 in additional compensation. For some families, like the Morettis with 3 young children, it was the difference between financial stability and poverty. Janet Morrison called me in tears when she received her restitution check. "Sarah, this means my daughter can go to college. The money Tommy died protecting is finally going where it should have gone 7 years ago." But beyond the financial compensation was something even more valuable: the restoration of our husbands' true legacies. The department issued new death certificates for all 47 firefighters, correctly classifying their deaths as heroic action in line of duty. David's new certificate, which arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in May, brought me to my knees in our living room. The citation read, "Captain David Mitchell died as a direct result of heroic actions taken to save civilian lives during the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Physical evidence confirms that Captain Mitchell positioned his body to shield civilians from falling debris, sacrificing his own life to protect others. His actions exemplify the highest ideals of the fire service and represent extraordinary heroism worthy of the department's highest honors." The personal cost of the investigation was finally starting to ease. Hospital administration reached out to offer me my old position back, with a formal apology for the way I'd been treated. My relationship with my sister Karen slowly healed as she came to understand that my fight hadn't been about obsession, it had been about justice. Most importantly, the firefighting community that had once shunned me was embracing me again. Active firefighters stopped me on the street to thank me for exposing the corruption that had infected their department. Widows from other tragedies reached out for advice on fighting their own battles against bureaucratic indifference. Reynolds' sentencing was scheduled for July 15, and I planned to be there to deliver a victim impact statement. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt like the hardest part was behind me. Justice was being served, families were being compensated, and David's memory was finally being honored properly. The burden Reynolds had dismissed me as had accomplished everything I'd set out to do and more. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed on July 15, 2008, the day of Reynolds' sentencing. 43 of the 47 families affected by his fraud were present, many of them flying in from across the country to witness this moment of accountability. Reynolds looked dramatically different from the confident, powerful man who had insulted me at the memorial dinner 8 months earlier. He'd lost weight. His hair had gone completely gray, and he moved like someone carrying an enormous burden of shame and regret. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Tommy Morrison's widow, had a reputation for being tough but fair. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence, every victim impact statement, and the complete scope of Reynolds' crimes before making her sentencing decision. The prosecution presented their case: methodically systematic fraud totaling $8.2 million, conspiracy to obstruct justice, intimidation of witnesses, and perjury. They recommended the maximum sentence of 25 years, arguing that Reynolds had betrayed the most sacred trust in American society, the care of families whose loved ones died protecting others. Reynolds' defense attorney tried to portray him as a scapegoat, claiming he'd been following orders from city officials who were now distancing themselves from the scandal. But the evidence was overwhelming that Reynolds had been the architect and primary beneficiary of the scheme. When my turn came to deliver my victim impact statement, I walked to the podium carrying David's helmet and the original note he'd written, "Me." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, my husband, Captain David Mitchell, died saving 23 people on September 11, 2001, for 7 years. I believed that his sacrifice was properly honored and that the benefits I received reflected the true value of his heroism. I was wrong." I detailed how Reynolds' fraud had affected not just my family's finances, but our emotional healing and David's legacy. Mr. Reynolds didn't just steal money from us. He stole recognition, dignity, and closure. He forced me to become an investigator, an advocate, and ultimately a burden to his criminal enterprise, when all I wanted was to grieve my husband and honor his memory. I looked directly at Reynolds, who was staring at his hands. "Mr. Reynolds, you called me a burden because I wouldn't stay silent about your crimes. You were right, he was a burden. But David taught me that being a burden to bad people is a badge of honor." The courtroom was completely silent as I concluded, "I don't hate you, Mr. Reynolds. Hate would dishonor David's memory. But I do want you to understand that your actions had consequences far beyond the money you stole. You forced dozens of families to relive their worst tragedies, to fight for recognition that should have been given freely, and to doubt whether their loved ones' sacrifices truly mattered. That's a special kind of cruelty that deserves appropriate punishment." Other family members delivered similarly powerful statements. Janet Morrison spoke about her daughter's college dreams. Carol Stevens talked about the financial stress that nearly cost her the family home. Maria Santos detailed the psychological toll of the investigation and intimidation. When all the victim statements were complete, Judge Morrison addressed Reynolds directly. "Mr. Reynolds, you held a position of extraordinary trust. Families in their darkest hour relied on you to treat their loved ones' sacrifices with dignity and honesty. Instead, you saw their grief as an opportunity for personal enrichment." She sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison, ordered full restitution plus damages, and banned him from ever holding public office again. "Your crimes represent a betrayal not just of individual families, but of the social contract that binds our society together. Public servants who exploit tragedy for personal gain strike at the very heart of civic trust." As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, sadness for the years of pain his crimes had caused, and gratitude that David's sacrifice was finally being properly honored. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and other families, I made one final statement. Today isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that the families of heroes are treated with the respect and honesty they deserve. And it's about proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept corruption as normal. That evening, I sat in David's chair, holding the official court documents that detailed Reynolds' conviction and sentence. For the first time since September 11, 2001, I felt like David could truly rest in peace. His sacrifice had been properly acknowledged, his memory had been restored, and justice had finally been served. The burden was lifted, and I was free to begin the next chapter of my life. 1 year after Reynolds' sentencing, I stood in a conference room overlooking Ground Zero, holding the official incorporation papers for the David Mitchell Memorial Foundation. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful: to ensure that first responder families received the support, recognition, and benefits they deserved, and to investigate any cases where corruption or bureaucratic indifference prevented proper care. The foundation's first board meeting included Maria Santos as vice president, Michael Chen as legal counsel, Dr. Patricia Williams as medical advisor, and Rachel Torres as communications director. We'd formed an unlikely but effective team, bound together by our shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing what we'd endured. "Sarah," Michael said, reviewing our first-year goals, "we've already received inquiries from families in 12 states. The Reynolds case has opened a lot of eyes to similar problems across the country. Our first major case involved firefighter families in Chicago who suspected their death benefits had been improperly calculated. Using the investigative techniques I'd learned during my own battle, we uncovered a pattern of discrimination that had cost minority families hundreds of thousands in benefits over a decade. The Foundation's work was demanding but fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Every family we helped honor their loved ones' memory properly felt like a small victory for David's legacy. Every corrupt official we exposed was another step toward the accountability he would have demanded. But the most meaningful part of my new life was the speaking engagements. I traveled across the country, addressing groups of first responder families, civic organizations, and law enforcement academies. My message was always the same: ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice as normal. At a conference in Dallas, a young police widow approached me after my presentation. "Mrs. Mitchell, my husband was killed in the line of duty 6 months ago, and I'm getting the runaround from the department about his benefits. They keep telling me to be patient, but I think something's wrong." I gave her my card and the contact information for our foundation. "Don't be patient with people who are taking advantage of your grief," I told her. "Trust your instincts and fight for what your husband earned." 3 months later, she called to tell me that our investigation had uncovered embezzlement in her husband's benefit fund and that the police chief had been arrested. "You saved my family's financial future," she said through tears. "And you taught me that being a burden to bad people is exactly what my husband would want me to be." The personal healing came gradually. I started dating again, something I thought would never happen. Dr. James Parker was a trauma surgeon at Mount Sinai, a widower who understood loss and the importance of honoring the past while building a future. David's memory wasn't threatened by new love, it was enhanced by it, because David would have wanted me to be happy. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I stood at David's memorial wall with James beside me, reading the new plaque that had been installed after Reynolds' conviction: "Captain David Mitchell, hero, leader, protector. He gave his life saving 23 civilians on September 11, 2001. His sacrifice exemplifies the highest ideals of service and represents extraordinary heroism worthy of eternal honor. He would be proud of what you've accomplished." James said quietly. I thought about the past 10 years, the grief, the investigation, the fight for justice, and the foundation that was now helping families across the country. He always said, "The world needs your light." I think I finally understand what he meant. The Foundation's annual report showed remarkable impact. 47 families had received corrected benefit classifications, 8 corrupt officials had been prosecuted, and over $12 million in stolen funds had been recovered and returned to first responder families. But the numbers didn't capture the real victory. We'd proven that corruption couldn't hide behind the grief of heroes' families. We'd shown that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to stay silent. We'd honored not just David's memory, but the memory of every hero whose sacrifice deserved better than bureaucratic indifference or criminal exploitation. As I write this story, Reynolds is serving his sentence in federal prison. The fire department has implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent similar corruption, and the David Mitchell Memorial Foundation continues to fight for families who need someone in their corner. Chief Reynolds was right about one thing: I was a burden, but he was wrong about what that meant. Being a burden to corruption, to injustice, to those who would exploit tragedy for personal gain isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. David died protecting innocent people because he believed that was his duty as a human being. I exposed the corruption that dishonored his memory because I believed that was my duty as his wife and as a citizen. Some burdens are worth carrying. Some fights are worth having, and sometimes, the person everyone dismisses as powerless is actually the most dangerous enemy corruption could face. If you've made it this far in my story, remember this: you have more power than you think. When faced with injustice, you can choose to stay silent or you can choose to be a burden to bad people. Choose to be the burden. The world needs your light. Just like David always said, it needed mine. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing, and thank you for proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept corruption as normal. Share your own stories in the comments below, because every story of courage inspires someone else to find their own strength, and every burden we carry makes the world a little bit better.